This short film is about three artists, and a time when these three artists were perhaps happiest in their lives and achieving the greatest ambitions of their work. This film is also about the liberation, light and environment of the south of France and its coast. This film is about Claude Monet, Paul Cézanne and Vincent van Gogh, and three works that I consider to be masterpieces. This film is mostly about the summer of one particular year, 1888. Back in 1857, Monet was broken by the death of his mother when he was 16, and Monet's father, in revenge for Monet's chosen career as a painter, refused to exempt him from 7 years military service in the cavalry in Algeria. Monet, destitute after his son was born to his lover Camille, and after his father refused to help, attempted suicide in the Seine. Monet married Camille in 1870, but she died in 1879. Cézanne's biographers agree that happiness was scarce in his life, and anger never distant. His mother had always been quick to take offence, and Cézanne, when young, having been punched by another child in the street in Aix-en-Provence, came to hate physical contact, and in old age raged against Émile Bernard for having steadied him when stumbling. Cézanne's father was against his son's chosen career as an artist, and Cézanne had to hide from him his mistress Hortense and the son they had together, for fear of being dispossessed of his allowance. But finally, and perhaps inevitably, in 1878, his father found out and a rift ensued. Vincent van Gogh was troubled by depression and mental illness for the whole of his adult life, and suffered deeply from his two unrequited loves, of his landlady's daughter in Stockwell in London and his cousin Cornelia in Etten in the Netherlands. His tendency to push himself to extremes in his missionary work transferred easily in 1879 with his change of career to driven artist. However, for all three artists, the 1880s, and especially the last few years leading up to 1888, represented three elements coming together: a path to artistic achievement, a move towards a measure of personal happiness, and the strengthening relationship with the south of France. For Cézanne, the move to the south was merely a return to his childhood Provençal roots. In 1870, at the start of the Franco-Prussian War, Cézanne had fled with his mistress Hortense to L'Estaque, on the coast near Marseille. The painter Eugène Boudin, Monet's teacher and mentor and lifelong correspondent, had travelled to Antibes as early as 1882. Also, Monet saw one of Cézanne's paintings of L'Estaque from the Impressionist exhibition of 1877, and probably saw others when he visited Cézanne on his way back from Bordighera in 1883. For Van Gogh, after the lightening of his palette, the result of contact with the Impressionists in Paris in 1886, and after his linear brushwork became a vehicle for a unified vision, like Cézanne's motif, the idea of a community of artists in the sun-drenched light of southern France took hold. Monet found a new love, Alice Ochedé, in the 1880s, and first visited the south in 1883, painting Monte Carlo, crossing the border to Bordighera, just inside Italy. From there, in 1884, painting its gardens and views of Ventimiglia before crossing back to paint in Menton. Monet had not enjoyed the experience, finding the intensity of light required him to abandon the greyish palette he had developed painting the north coast of France, and struggled to capture the blazing colours under the southern sun. When surrounded with such dazzling light, he wrote, one finds one's palette rather poor. The views appear a little washed out, and earth tones still manage to permeate the lightened palette, with brightened tones such as cadmium yellow sitting uncomfortably on them. Arguably the only successes in capturing intense light were done using the strong contrast of the shade in the garden of Moreno. After 4 years though, Monet returned to the challenge in January of 1888, this time deciding to come first to the place his teacher Boudin had painted, the old town of Antibes, from across the bay. Clearly, Boudin's viewpoint did not work for Monet, the bay too open, the light too intense on the middle ground of the town of Antibes. Still in February, Monet wrote to Rodin, "I'm fencing and wrestling with the sun, and what a sun it is. In order to paint here, one would need gold and precious stones." However, Monet then began to seek shade, to mediate the flood of light, as he had done in Bordighera, by painting from the Sailly Gardens, and the masterpieces began to arrive. This work, from the Plateau d'Antibes, is from late in the day, but eventually Monet was able to produce this painting of the Cap d'Antibes in the full intensity of an overhead sun. From this point on, Monet produced a series of works in May, his last month in Antibes, of the Mediterranean pines in Juin-les-Pins, taking the intense colours of the sun and adapting them throughout the day. This work, for me, with the shadowed branches in lilac and lit ones in an orange made deeper with alizar in crimson, are the height of Monet's achievement with the southern light. As Monet wrote to Alice Ochedé, and as this final work of Monet's from the south shows, Antibes was finally all gilded by the sun, freeing itself from the beautiful pink and blue mountains and the chain of the Alps, eternally covered in snow. Sweetness itself, white, pink, blue, all of it enveloped in this fairy tale-like air. After 1878, Cezanne's overbearing father eventually became reconciled with Cezanne's choice of career and his having had a family clandestinely, and so built a studio for him in the family home in the Bastide du Jas de Buffon. Meanwhile, Cezanne became a resident in L'Estaque, painting with Renoir there in 1883 on the latter's first trip to the south. In 1886, Cezanne was able to marry Hortense, and on the death of his father, Cezanne inherited the estate Jas de Buffon. In 1888, he was able to move with Hortense and his son into the Jas de Buffon for the most idyllic period of his life. The 1880s had brought Cezanne's closeness with his native Provence, painting a series of works of Mont Saint-Victoire and of the Jas de Buffon. In these works, Cezanne had developed his idea of the motif, of a series of brush marks unifying the canvas into the artist's vision inspired by nature. 1888 saw Cezanne produce a series of portraits of Hortense at Jas de Buffon, this work of the Jas de Buffon idyll itself, and this, the last ever work Cezanne would produce in L'Estaque, his final word on the motif of his southern place of exile from the war and from his father. Paris had been transformative for Vincent van Gogh. Having been exposed to the work of the Impressionists, his works through 1886 begin to show the earth tones and greys of his Dutch works, inspired by the Barbizon school, slowly beginning to colour. Through 1887, his colours start to blaze, and his brushwork, under the influence of Cezanne and Japanese works, becomes a charged surface, its movement expressing the natural environment, but with inner illumination. So, as Vincent wrote in a letter to his brother Theo in autumn of 1887, he sought landscapes which could reflect this spiritual light and colour. As soon as possible, I plan to spend some time in the south, where there is even more colour and even more sun. Also, the intensity of his living had taken its toll on his physical health, and he headed for the south, to Arles, early in the following year, arriving in February 1888. Van Gogh was full of hope for his work and for his plan of a painter's school opening up the south. He painted blossoms, inspired by Japanese painting, through the spring, and made arrangements for the Yellow House to be made ready for the arrival of Gauguin. In June, he made his only journey to the Mediterranean, to the Camargue town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. With flat planes of colour from the ukiyo-e painters, and the dramatic movement of his brushwork, this work in particular, of 3 cottages, has the spiritual intensity which charges Van Gogh's work from now on. As Van Gogh said of the Camargue landscape, it was infinite, like the sea. Cézanne's happiness did not last, and by 1893 he fell into depression and, becoming mistrustful of visitors, isolated himself from the world, dying in 1906. Van Gogh's colony amounted to nothing but a tempestuous cohabitation with Gauguin in the autumn of 1888, the mutilation of his ear in December, and a series of breakdowns leading to his suicide 19 months later. Monet, on the other hand, used the lessons learnt in his series in the Southern Light to go on to make his serial observations of a motif in the Creuse Valley, his second series of haystacks in Giverny, Rouen Cathedral, and for his only other trip to the Mediterranean, to Venice, from October to December of 1908, and that time he took Alice Ochedé with him.